In the gritty industrial city of the 1920s, 14-year-old orphan Jonah is accused of a devastating factory fire that he didn't cause, landing him in a brutal detention center ruled by corruption and cruelty. Desperate to clear his name, Jonah discovers a dangerous conspiracy with the help of a frail but fearless boy, Tommy, and his estranged older brother, a war-hardened lawyer. As Jonah uncovers the truth, he must risk everything to expose the lies and fight for a future beyond the shadows of his past. Will Jonah find justice in a world built to silence him? And how much will he, and those he loves, have to sacrifice for the truth? The whistle of the factory screeched through the smog-filled air of Greystone City, a sound that had haunted Jonah's mornings since he was 10. At 14, his frame was wiry but strong, his hands rough from countless hours at the loom. Yet today, as the morning bell tolled, something felt off, a heaviness in the air that lingered like the gray soot clinging to the cracked cobblestone. Jonah clutched his patched jacket tighter as he trudged toward the towering smokestacks of Mercer Textile Mill. The factory loomed like a grim fortress, its windows smeared with grime, the shadows of its machinery twisting and groaning like tired ghosts. Inside, the air was heavy with the acrid stench of oil and burnt fabric. "Late again, are we, boy?" Mr. Wiggins, the factory foreman, spat. His teeth were stained yellow, his eyes perpetually bloodshot. Jonah didn't bother replying, knowing it would only lead to a cuff around the ear. Instead, he ducked his head and hurried to his station, the whir of the machines drowning out the grumbling of his empty stomach. It was mid-shift when the flames began. A spark, small, almost invisible, leapt from the frayed wiring above Jonah's station. In the chaos of rattling looms and hollering supervisors, no one noticed until it was too late. Fire engulfed the dry cotton stacks, and the factory erupted into pandemonium. Workers screamed, smoke billowed, and the heat licked at Jonah's skin as he scrambled to pull a younger boy from under a collapsed beam. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the mill was a blackened skeleton. The next day, Jonah awoke not in his shared tenement room, but in a cell. "You've done it now, boy," Wiggins sneered, standing on the other side of the iron bars. His voice carried a dangerous calm, the kind that made Jonah's blood run cold. "Thought you could cover your tracks by playing hero, eh? Everyone knows you had a grudge against the factory." Jonah stared at him, his throat dry. "I didn't save it for the judge," Wiggins snapped. "Maybe you'll think twice before torching the place that feeds you." Jonah was thrown into the back of a police wagon, his protests drowned by the clanging of metal wheels on uneven streets. The accusations spread like wildfire through Greystone. A bitter, hateful narrative took hold. Jonah, the angry orphan, had destroyed the very factory that gave him work. At Greystone Juvenile Detention Center, the world grew darker. The facility was a labyrinth of cold stone walls and barred windows, ruled by a warden whose cruelty was whispered about in the bleak dormitories. Warden Clemens was a towering man with a scar slicing across his jaw, his boots echoing like gunshots on the polished floor. Jonah quickly learned that Clemens relished in breaking spirits. "You'll learn discipline here," Clemens growled on Jonah's first day. "You'll learn respect, and if you don't," he smirked, leaving the threat unfinished. The routine was brutal. Endless chores, grueling hours in the stone quarry, and meals that barely staved off hunger. Jonah's defiance earned him punishments. Isolation in the freezing basement, lashes that left scars beneath his shirt. But it was the ostracism that cut the deepest. The other boys, eager to avoid trouble, steered clear of him. "Factory burner," they called him in hushed tones, all except Tommy. Tommy was a wisp of a boy, no older than 12, with hollow cheeks and eyes too large for his gaunt face. He was prone to coughing fits that rattled his thin chest, and Jonah often wondered how he survived the harsh conditions of the detention center. Yet Tommy had a quiet resilience that reminded Jonah of the stray cat that used to linger near the mill. Scrappy, clinging to life against all odds. "Don't mind them," Tommy whispered one night, as they sat on their thin, lumpy mattresses in the dormitory. "They don't know the truth, but we do." Jonah looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Tommy hesitated. glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I heard the guards talking. The fire wasn't your fault. Wiggins, he's hiding something." The words planted a seed in Jonah's mind, one that grew despite the oppressive walls surrounding him. If Wiggins had framed him, there had to be proof, and Jonah was determined to find it. The days turned into weeks, and Jonah began noticing things he hadn't before. Scraps of newspapers tucked into the guards' pockets, hushed conversations that stopped when he approached. He and Tommy started collecting every bit of information they could find. They worked quietly, carefully. Tommy slipping clippings from the warden's office, Jonah piecing together overheard snippets. Each discovery painted a damning picture. The factory's wiring had been faulty for years. Complaints from workers were ignored, inspections forged. The night of the fire, Wiggins had been in the office, shredding papers. Jonah's gut twisted with rage and fear. The truth was there, just out of reach, but exposing it from behind bars felt impossible. Then, one evening, a name surfaced in their search that made Jonah's heart stop. Caleb, his brother. Caleb had left for the war 6 years ago, a wide-shouldered boy with dreams of becoming a lawyer. When no letters came back, Jonah assumed he'd been killed. But now, his name was on a list of Greystone's public defenders. Could it really be him? Jonah felt a flicker of hope, fragile but alive. If Caleb was out there, he might be Jonah's last chance to clear his name. But reaching him would require courage and the risk of severe punishment if caught. Jonah clenched his fists, determination surging through him. He had lost his freedom, his reputation, and the trust of the city, but he wouldn't lose the fight for the truth. The flickering lantern light in the juvenile detention center's communal hall cast eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. Jonah and Tommy huddled at their assigned table during the last few minutes of free time before lights out. Tommy's cough rattled the air like brittle paper being torn, but the boy waved off Jonah's concern. "I'm fine," Tommy muttered, his voice thin but urgent. "Listen, I found something today." He slipped a folded scrap of newspaper from the waistband of his threadbare trousers and slid it across the table. The faint ink smudges on Jonah's fingers felt like evidence of a crime as he unfolded it. The headline read, "Fire Claims Lives at Mercer Mill, Orphan to Blame." Below it, smaller lines caught Jonah's attention. "Owner denies allegations of neglect. Unsafe wiring ruled out by foreman Wiggins." Jonah clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his skin. "Lies," he hissed under his breath. Tommy leaned closer. "Look at the bottom." He jabbed a thin finger at a name. Caleb Summers, defense attorney. Jonah's breath hitched. "That's my brother," he whispered, the words barely audible over the dull hum of the room. He hadn't spoken Caleb's name in years, not since the night he'd left their tenement with a pack slung over his shoulder, promising to send for Jonah when he could. The war had swallowed Caleb whole, or so Jonah thought. "He's a lawyer now?" Tommy asked, his voice tinged with awe. Jonah nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. If Caleb was alive, why hadn't he come back for him? Why had he left Jonah to fend for himself in the bleak corners of Greystone City? But those questions would have to wait. Right now, Caleb was his only hope. Over the next week, Jonah and Tommy planned. They needed to get a message to Caleb, but the warden's office was heavily guarded and mail was tightly controlled. Tommy's knack for sneaking through small spaces proved invaluable. On a night when the guards were distracted by a minor scuffle in the dormitories, Tommy slipped into the warden's office and returned with a piece of unused stationery and an envelope. Jonah wrote carefully by the dim light of the dormitory window, the pencil trembling in his hand. "Dear Caleb, you probably don't remember me, or maybe you don't want to. It's Jonah. I'm at Greystone Juvenile Detention Center. They say I burned down the mill, but I didn't. I need your help to prove it. Wiggins framed me, and there's more to this than they're letting on. If you get this, please come. Jonah." Getting the letter out was another challenge. The guards inspected all outgoing mail, so Jonah slipped it into Tommy's thin sock, hoping the frail boy would go unnoticed during the morning inspection. The risk was enormous, but desperation left little room for caution. The next morning, as the boys shuffled in line for roll call, Jonah's heart pounded in his chest. Tommy moved ahead, his bony shoulders hunched. The guard barely glanced at him before waving him through. Relief flooded Jonah's veins. But it was short-lived. 2 hours later, during stone quarry duty, Warden Clemens stormed onto the work site. His leather boots crunched ominously against the gravel. "Jonah!" Clemens bellowed, his voice carrying across the yard. The guards flanked him like wolves, circling their prey. Jonah's stomach churned. He stepped forward, trying to mask the tremor in his knees. Clemens held up the letter. The sight of it twisted Jonah's insides. "Care to explain this?" Jonah met Clemens's gaze, his voice steady despite the pounding in his ears. "I was asking for help. That's all." The warden sneered. "Help? You think your brother's gonna save you? He's probably forgotten you exist." When Jonah didn't respond, Clemens's face darkened. "You want attention, boy? I'll give you attention. Solitary. A week." 2 guards grabbed Jonah by the arms, dragging him toward the dim, cold basement. Tommy's wide eyes followed him, filled with guilt and fear. Jonah shot him a quick, reassuring nod before the heavy door slammed shut. The first hours in solitary passed in deafening silence, broken only by the faint sound of dripping water. The room was damp and windowless, the darkness so complete it felt alive, pressing against Jonah's chest like a weight. He sat curled in the corner, his knees drawn to his chest, replaying Clemens's words in his mind. Had Caleb really forgotten him? Jonah clung to the memory of his brother's broad smile and warm voice. Caleb had always been his protector, even when their mother fell ill and their father vanished into the haze of drink and despair. Jonah refused to believe that the man who carried him on his shoulders through the crowded streets of Greystone would abandon him now. Days blurred into nights in the pitch-black cell, but Jonah's resolve hardened. He would endure this. If Caleb had received the letter, he would come. And if not, Jonah would find another way. The truth wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing the lies that had stolen so many lives, including those who hadn't survived the fire. When Jonah was finally released from solitary, he stumbled into the blinding daylight, his legs weak and his stomach hollow. Tommy was waiting in the courtyard, his face pale but lit with cautious hope. Did it work?" Jonah rasped, his voice raw from disuse. Tommy's grin was small but genuine. "Your brother's coming." Jonah's heart skipped. "How do you know?" Tommy glanced around before leaning closer. "The warden's been on edge. He got a letter this morning, and I heard him cursing about lawyers sticking their noses where they don't belong." A flicker of hope stirred in Jonah's chest, but it was quickly tempered by reality. Caleb might come, but Clemens wouldn't make it easy. Jonah knew that the fight was far from over. That evening, as Jonah stared out the dormitory window at the faint glow of the city beyond, he whispered to himself, "I'll prove it. I'll make them see." The distant sound of a train whistle echoed through the night, and for the first time in months, Jonah allowed himself to believe that rescue, however slim, might be on its way. The echo of Caleb's name hung in Jonah's mind as he worked in the frigid quarry the next day, his shovel biting into the unyielding stone. The possibility of his brother coming both comforted and terrified him. Caleb was the strongest person Jonah had ever known, but 6 years was a long time. Who was Caleb now? What had he seen? And would he even care to help? Questions swirled like a cold wind, but Jonah buried them as deeply as he did the rubble beneath his boots. "Keep moving, Summers!" barked a guard, slamming his baton against the metal wheelbarrow. Jonah didn't flinch. He bent down, lifting another shovelful of stone, his muscles aching under the strain. Nearby, Tommy struggled with his own load, his small frame buckling under the weight. Jonah stepped closer, swapping out his own lighter haul for Tommy. "Thanks," Tommy wheezed, his voice barely audible. Jonah gave him a small nod, his gaze darting toward the distant gates of the facility. If Caleb was coming, it wouldn't be long now. The moment arrived on a cold, gray afternoon. The sound of the facility gates grinding open made Jonah glance up from the dining hall's chipped wooden table. A figure strode into the courtyard beyond, his coat sharply tailored, his boots polished to a shine that stood in stark contrast to the grimy surrounding. Caleb. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. His brother looked older, his once youthful face now set with the lines of hard-earned experience. His broad shoulders and confident stride radiated authority, but his dark eyes searched the courtyard, softening when they landed on Jonah's thin frame through the barred window. Tommy, sitting across from Jonah, whispered, "Is that him?" Jonah nodded, unable to speak. He stood, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to anchor himself. Before he could move, a guard's bark shattered the moment. "Sit down, Summers." Jonah froze, but Caleb stepped forward, his voice ringing out with a calm that carried its own authority. "I'm here to see my brother, Jonah Summers." The guard hesitated, but the warden's voice cut through the air. "Let him in." Warden Clemens emerged from his office, his face a mask of disdain as he greeted Caleb. "We've got rules here, Mr. Summers. Visits are supervised and limited." "I'm not here for a friendly chat," Caleb replied, his tone steady but laced with steel. "I'm here to talk about the false charges against my brother." Jonah's chest tightened as Clemens's face darkened. "You'll find the charges are well documented, lawyer or not." Caleb didn't flinch. "I'm sure they are. And I'll be reviewing every document, every statement, and every scrap of evidence you have. Until then, I'd like to see Jonah." The tension in the room was palpable, but Clemens relented with a curt nod. 10 minutes, that's all." In the small visitation room, Jonah sat at a scarred wooden table, his heart pounding as Caleb walked in. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb smiled, a ghost of the grin Jonah remembered from years ago. "You've grown," Caleb said, his voice warm despite the weight of the moment. "I almost didn't recognize you." Jonah managed a small smile. "You look different too, older." Caleb chuckled softly, sitting down across from him. War does that to a man. The humor faded quickly, and Caleb leaned forward, his gaze searching Jonah's face. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Jonah spoke quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush as he recounted the fire, Wiggins's accusations, and the brutal conditions of the detention center. He described Tommy's discoveries, the rumors about the factory's unsafe wiring, and the mounting evidence pointing to a cover-up. Caleb listened intently, his expression darkening with each detail. When Jonah finished, Caleb exhaled deeply, his hands clasped tightly together. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "But we have a starting point. Wiggins's name comes up in more legal disputes than I can count. He's got a history of forging reports to protect factory profits." Jonah's eyes widened. "Then you can prove it?" Caleb hesitated, his gaze steady. "It won't be easy. Clemens and Wiggins are powerful men in this city. They have connections and they'll do everything they can to bury the truth. But I'll fight for you, Jonah. I promise." The words filled Jonah with a cautious hope. For the first time in years, he felt as though someone was truly in his corner. After Caleb left, Jonah returned to the dormitory, his mind racing. Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor, his thin fingers tracing the edges of another newspaper clipping. "How did it go?" Tommy asked, his voice hoarse. "He believes me," Jonah said, his voice steadier than he felt. "He's going to fight for me." Tommy grinned, but the smile quickly faded as a cough racked his body. Jonah crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You should tell the infirmary." Tommy shook his head. "They don't care about kids like me." Jonah frowned but didn't argue. Instead, he sat beside Tommy, staring out the window at the pale moonlight. "We'll get out of here," Jonah said quietly. "Both of us." Tommy didn't reply, but the faint hope in his eyes was enough for Jonah to hold on to. The following days brought both progress and peril. Caleb filed motions to review the evidence against Jonah, forcing Clemens to scramble. Meanwhile, guards kept a closer eye on Jonah and Tommy, their movements restricted and their punishment for even minor infractions harsher than ever. One evening, Tommy slipped a new discovery into Jonah's hand, a crumpled memo from Wiggins's office. The note was brief but damning, referencing payment to Clemens in exchange for ensuring undesirable elements were silenced. Jonah's stomach churned as he read it. The corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. When Caleb returned a week later, his expression was grim but determined. "We've got enough to file an appeal," he told Jonah, "but we need more. Something that directly ties Wiggins to the fire." Jonah nodded, his resolve hardening. "We'll find it." As Caleb prepared to leave, he placed a firm hand on Jonah's shoulder. "Stay strong, Jonah. They'll try to break you, but you're tougher than they are. Always have been." Jonah swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Thanks for coming back." Caleb smiled faintly. "I should have come sooner." As the door closed behind Caleb, Jonah felt the weight of his brother's words. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he truly believed it could be won. The tension inside Greystone Juvenile Detention Center had thickened, the guards' eyes sharper, their footsteps quicker, as if they could sense that something was unraveling. Jonah and Tommy moved carefully, speaking in whispers as they pieced together the scraps of information that might finally expose the truth. Caleb's visit had given Jonah a renewed sense of purpose, but it had also drawn unwanted attention. Warden Clemens was watching him now, and Jonah knew the man wouldn't hesitate to crush any hope he dared to show. One cold morning, as Jonah and Tommy hauled gravel in the stone quarry, a guard shoved Jonah hard in the back, nearly sending him sprawling. "Keep your head down, factory burner," the guard sneered. "Don't think your fancy lawyer brother can save you." Jonah straightened, his hands clenched into fists, but Tommy's quiet voice stopped him. "Not here," Tommy murmured. "Save it for when it counts." Jonah exhaled slowly, letting the anger ebb. He nodded at Tommy and returned to his work, his mind racing. If the guards were already rattled, it meant Caleb's motions were making waves, but it also meant they had to act fast. That night, while the dormitory was steeped in shadow and most of the boys were asleep, Tommy revealed the next piece of the puzzle. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pillowcase and handed it to Jonah. "I found it in the warden's desk," Tommy whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's not about the fire, but it shows they're paying off inspectors. If Wiggins could fake reports about safety, he could fake the ones about you too." Jonah unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. It was a ledger, listing payments to various officials, inspectors, judges, even a few police officers. Wiggins's name appeared more than once, scrawled in hasty, incriminating handwriting. "This is it," Jonah whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of hope and fear. "This proves they're covering something up." Tommy smiled faintly, his face pale in the dim light. "Caleb can use it, right?" Jonah nodded, but his stomach tightened. Tommy's cough had worsened, and his frail frame seemed smaller every day. "Are you okay?" Jonah asked, his tone soft. Tommy shrugged, brushing off the question. "Just tired." Jonah frowned but didn't push further. He folded the ledger and tucked it inside his shirt, vowing to protect it with his life. The following day, Jonah managed to slip the ledger to a guard sympathetic to Caleb's case, a young man named Harris, who had overheard Clemens berating another staff member about Jonah's appeal. Harris agreed to deliver the evidence to Caleb, but not without a warning. "Be careful," Harris muttered. "Clemens is on edge. He's got half the guards watching you." Jonah nodded, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his chest. As Harris walked away, Jonah glanced over at Tommy, who was struggling to keep up with the other boys during a grueling round of outdoor drills. The sight of him stumbling sent a pang through Jonah's chest. Later that evening, Jonah confronted Tommy in the dormitory. "You need to go to the infirmary," he said firmly. "I'm fine," Tommy insisted, though his voice was little more than a whisper. "You're not fine," Jonah shot back, his frustration bubbling over. "You're coughing up blood, Tommy. You're not going to make it if you don't get help." Tommy's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "They don't care about me, Jonah. None of them do." Jonah placed a hand on Tommy's thin shoulder, his voice softening. "I care, and we're getting out of here. Together. But you have to let me help you." Tommy hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Jonah promised himself he'd find a way to get Tommy the care he needed, even if it meant risking everything. The days blurred together as the stakes grew higher. Caleb sent word that the appeal was gaining traction, but Wiggins and Clemens weren't backing down. Jonah could feel the pressure mounting. Guards searched his bunk regularly, Clemens's presence loomed like a shadow, and Tommy's health continued to decline. Then, one fateful night, everything came to a head. Jonah and Tommy had been lying awake, whispering about their plans for the future, what they would do once they were free. Jonah dreamed of leaving Greystone City behind, finding work far from the factories and the smoke-choked streets. Tommy's dream was simpler, to see the ocean. "I've never seen anything so big," Tommy said, his voice wistful. "Do you think it's really as blue as the pictures?" "It's bluer," Jonah promised, though he'd never seen it either. "We'll go together." Tommy smiled faintly, but before Jonah could say more, the dormitory door slammed open. Guards poured in, their faces grim. "Jonah Summers!" one of them barked. "You're coming with us!" Jonah's heart raced. "Why?" The guard grabbed him roughly by the arm. Warden's orders! Jonah glanced back at Tommy, who sat frozen, his wide eyes filled with fear. Stay here, Jonah whispered. I'll be back. In the warden's office, Clemens stood behind his desk, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. On the desk was the ledger Jonah had given Harris. Jonah's stomach dropped. You thought you could outsmart me? Clemens growled, his voice low and dangerous. You think a boy like you can bring me down? Jonah didn't reply, his jaw clenched tightly. Clemens leaned closer, his scarred face inches from Jonah's. You're nothing, Summers. No one cares about you. Not your brother, not the courts. And if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you disappear. Jonah's pulse thundered in his ears, but he held Clemens's gaze. You're scared, he said quietly. That's why you're doing this. Clemens's face darkened with fury. He grabbed Jonah by the shirt, hauling him closer. Watch your mouth, boy. But before Clemens could do more, the door burst open. Caleb strode in, flanked by two uniformed officers. Step away from my brother, Caleb commanded, his voice steady and cold. Clemens froze, his grip loosening. The officers stepped forward, their presence an unspoken warning. Caleb's eyes met Jonah's, and in that moment, Jonah felt a surge of hope stronger than anything he'd felt in months. Warden Clemens, Caleb said, his tone sharp. You've been served. The court has ordered an immediate review of this facility, and you're under investigation for corruption and abuse of power. Jonah's heart soared, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Clemens's scowl deepened, and his eyes burned with hatred as he reluctantly released Jonah. This isn't over, Clemens spat. No, Caleb agreed. It's just beginning. As Jonah followed Caleb out of the office, his brother placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You did good, Jonah. We've got them cornered. Jonah nodded, but his thoughts were with Tommy. The fight wasn't just about his freedom anymore. It was about justice for everyone Clemens and Wiggins had hurt, and it wasn't over yet. The tension in Greystone Juvenile Detention Center reached a breaking point in the days following Caleb's intervention. Warden Clemens, his power slipping, became more ruthless, lashing out at guards and inmates alike. The facility buzzed with whispers of an impending reckoning, but Jonah knew that Clemens was dangerous, a cornered animal with everything to lose. For Jonah and Tommy, the stakes had never been higher. Caleb's investigation had unearthed more damning evidence against Wiggins and Clemens, but the ledger wasn't enough to prove Jonah's innocence. They still needed something definitive to tie Wiggins to the fire, something Clemens would never let leave the walls of Greystone. One cold evening, as the boys prepared for lights out, Tommy's cough worsened. Jonah knelt beside him, concern etched into his face. Tommy's cheeks were sunken, his skin pale as parchment. You can't keep ignoring this, Jonah said quietly. We're so close, but you need to rest. Tommy shook his head, his voice barely audible. I'm not giving up now, not when you fought this hard. Jonah placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. We're getting out of here, Tommy. I promise. Tommy nodded weakly, his eyes closing as exhaustion overtook him. That night, Jonah's resolve hardened. He decided to act. The whispers among the guards hinted at a hidden file in Clemens's office, something that could expose Wiggins's role in the fire. Jonah didn't know what the file contained, but he was willing to risk everything to find it. He turned to Harris, the sympathetic guard during the next day's work detail. There's something in Clemens's office, Jonah said in a low voice. A file. I need to get it. Harris frowned, glancing around to ensure no one overheard. That's suicide, Jonah. The warden's on high alert. I don't have a choice, Jonah replied. If we don't find it, Wiggins walks free and I stay in here. Harris hesitated, then sighed. There's a shift change tonight. Clemens leaves the office for about 20 minutes. I'll keep watch, but if you get caught, he didn't finish the sentence. I won't, Jonah said, though his stomach churned with fear. The plan unfolded under the cover of night. When the guards' routines aligned, Jonah slipped through the shadows toward Clemens's office, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was eerily quiet, the faint flicker of a lantern casting long, wavering shadows on the stone walls. Harris stood near the end of the corridor, his posture tense. He nodded sharply as Jonah approached, then gestured toward the unlocked door. Make it quick, Harris muttered. Jonah slipped inside, the air heavy with the scent of tobacco and leather. The warden's desk loomed in the dim light, its surface cluttered with papers and an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. Jonah's fingers trembled as he rifled through the drawers, his ears straining for any sound outside. After several agonizing minutes, his hand brushed against a thick folder tucked beneath a pile of invoices. He yanked it free and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages. What he found made his breath catch. Inside were signed reports from Wiggins, detailing the faulty wiring and ignored safety protocols that led to the fire. The documents were dated months before the blaze, with Wiggins's scrawled signature at the bottom of each page. One memo stood out, a direct order to shred all evidence of negligence. It was damning. Jonah's chest tightened. This was it, the proof Caleb needed to bring Wiggins down and clear Jonah's name. But before he could close the folder, a heavy voice froze him in place. Well, Clemens drawled from the doorway. What do we have here? Clemens stepped into the room, his eyes blazing with fury. Jonah's pulse thundered in his ears as he clutched the folder to his chest. Put it down, boy, Clemens snarled, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. Jonah shook his head, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. This ends here. People are going to know what you've done. Clemens's lip curled in a sneer. You think anyone will believe a scrawny orphan over me, over Wiggins? You're nothing, Summers. Jonah squared his shoulders, his grip tightening on the folder. Not anymore. Clemens lunged, but Jonah darted around the desk, narrowly avoiding the warden's grasp. The commotion drew the attention of Harris, who appeared in the doorway, his face pale. Run, Jonah! Harris shouted. Jonah bolted, the folder clutched tightly against his chest. Clemens's shouts echoed down the corridor as Jonah sprinted through the maze-like halls of the detention center. Guards gave chase, their boots pounding against the stone floor, but Jonah's determination drove him forward. He burst into the dormitory, startling the boys awake. Tommy sat up, his face pale and confused. What's happening? He croaked. No time to explain, Jonah said breathlessly. We're leaving. Before Tommy could protest, the door slammed open and Clemens stormed in, flanked by 2 guards. That's enough, Clemens roared. Hand it over, or I'll make sure you regret it. The other boys stared in silence, their fear palpable. But Tommy, despite his frail frame, stepped forward. You can't stop him, he said, his voice trembling but defiant. The truth's already out. Clemens snarled and raised his baton, but before he could strike, a deafening whistle echoed through the facility. The gates creaked open, and Caleb entered, flanked by 2 police officers. That's far enough, Clemens, Caleb said, his voice cold as ice. We've got everything we need. Clemens froze, his fury turning to panic. The officers stepped forward, their presence an unspoken threat. Caleb's gaze softened as he looked at Jonah. You did good, little brother. Jonah handed Caleb the folder, his hands trembling with relief. The weight of months of fear and injustice lifted from his shoulders. As Clemens was escorted out in handcuffs, the boys in the dormitory erupted into whispers. Jonah turned to Tommy, who swayed unsteadily on his feet. You're going to be okay, Jonah said, steadying him. We both are. Tommy smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. You kept your promise. The victory was bittersweet. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Jonah felt the stirrings of hope. The truth was out, and freedom was within reach. The world outside Greystone Juvenile Detention Center seemed to shift as Caleb led Jonah and Tommy into the brisk evening air. The facility gates groaned shut behind them, but their oppressive weight still clung to Jonah like chain. It wasn't true freedom, not yet. Clemens and Wiggins had been arrested, but Wiggins's trial loomed ahead, and Jonah's name was still tethered to the fire. The folder of evidence Caleb carried was their best shot, but the battle for vindication had just begun. Tommy stumbled as they crossed the threshold, his legs buckling beneath him. Jonah caught him, panic surging in his chest. Tommy! Jonah cried, lowering him gently to the ground. Caleb knelt beside them, his lawyer's composure melting into the concern of an older brother. We need to get him to a doctor. Now. The ride to the hospital was tense, the sound of horse hooves on cobblestones filling the silence as Tommy's shallow breaths grew fainter. Caleb sat rigid, his hands gripping the medical bag he'd grabbed from a nearby constable. Jonah cradled Tommy's frail body, his mind racing with fear and helplessness. "You're going to be okay," Jonah murmured, his voice thick. "Just hang on a little longer." Tommy's lips twitched in a faint smile. "You're terrible at lying, Jonah," he rasped. Jonah couldn't stop the tears that pricked at his eyes. "Then don't make me have to." The hospital was a stark contrast to the dingy walls of the detention center. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the flicker of gas lamps cast soft, wavering light across the white-tiled halls. A nurse rushed forward as Caleb explained the situation, and within minutes, Tommy was whisked away on a stretcher. Jonah watched helplessly as the doors swung shut behind him, leaving an aching emptiness in their wake. "He's tough," Caleb said, resting a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "He'll pull through." Jonah nodded, but his heart twisted. Tommy had already endured more than anyone should, and Jonah couldn't shake the fear that his best friend's resilience might have reached its limit. The hours dragged on as they waited for news. Caleb paced the length of the dimly lit waiting room, his polished boots scuffing the floor. Jonah sat slumped in a chair, his head in his hands, replaying the night's events over and over. The folder of evidence sat on the table between them, a silent reminder of the fight still ahead. Finally, the door creaked open, and a weary-looking doctor stepped inside. Jonah jumped to his feet, his pulse pounding. "He's stable," the doctor said, his voice gentle but firm. "But he's severely malnourished and suffering from pneumonia. We've started treatment, but it's going to be a long recovery." Relief flooded Jonah's chest, but it was tempered by guilt. He had pushed Tommy to keep fighting, even when his body was failing him. "Can I see him?" Jonah asked. The doctor nodded. "Just for a few minutes. He needs rest." Tommy lay in a narrow hospital bed, his face pale but peaceful. The rise and fall of his chest was faint but steady, and the harsh rattle of his breath had eased. Jonah pulled up a chair beside him, his throat tight. "Hey, Tommy," Jonah whispered, his voice trembling. "We made it. You're safe now." Tommy's eyes fluttered open, and he offered a faint smile. "Told you I'd get you out of there." Jonah laughed softly, though tears blurred his vision. "Pretty sure it was the other way around." Tommy's gaze flickered to the folder Jonah still clutched tightly. "Did we win?" Jonah hesitated, then nodded. "We're close. Caleb's got everything he needs to take Wiggins down." Tommy's smile widened, though it was still faint. "Good. Then it was worth it." Jonah leaned closer, gripping Tommy's hand tightly. "You're going to see it, Tommy. The ocean, remember? We're going together." Tommy's eyelids grew heavy, but his smile remained. "I'll hold you to that." The next morning, Jonah and Caleb returned to the city courthouse, the weight of the evidence in their hands. The trial against Wiggins had been expedited, the fire's devastating impact demanding swift justice. Caleb moved through the courthouse halls with the confidence of a man who had spent years navigating its twists and turns. Jonah followed close behind, feeling small and out of place in the vast echoing chambers. As they entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the crowd. Wiggins sat at the defendant's table, his face pale but defiant. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Wiggins's gaze remained fixed on Jonah, his eyes burning with malice. Jonah swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He felt Caleb's reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," Caleb said softly. "I'm right here." The trial unfolded in a blur of testimony and cross-examinations. Caleb presented the evidence with precision, each document and witness statement building a damning case against Wiggins. The jury listened intently, their expressions growing grimmer with each revelation. Jonah sat silently, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. When Caleb called him to the stand, his heart pounded, but he forced himself to stand tall. "Jonah," Caleb began, his voice steady, "can you describe what you saw the night of the fire?" Jonah took a deep breath, his voice trembling but clear as he recounted the events. He spoke of the spark, the chaos, and Wiggins's attempts to silence him. He described the factory's conditions, the rumors of neglect, and the harsh reality of being framed for something he didn't do. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Caleb gave him a small nod, and Jonah stepped down, his legs weak, but his heart lighter. He had spoken his truth. The trial ended with a verdict that sent ripples through the city. Wiggins was convicted of gross negligence and conspiracy, his reputation and fortune shattered. Jonah's name was cleared, his innocence finally recognized. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, Jonah turned to Caleb, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." Caleb smiled, his expression filled with pride. "No, Jonah, it's just beginning." That evening, Jonah returned to the hospital. The weight of the trial finally lifted. Tommy was awake, his color returning, and his eyes brighter. "We did it," Jonah said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Wiggins is finished." Tommy grinned weakly. "Told you we'd win." Jonah smiled, his heart swelling with relief and gratitude. For the first time in years, the future felt wide open, a horizon waiting to be explored. The world beyond the courtroom and the hospital felt like a different planet to Jonah, a place where the air seemed less heavy and possibilities stretched farther than the smoke-stained rooftops of Greystone City. Though the trial was over, Jonah's fight for a sense of normalcy had just begun. The city remembered the fire and the lives it claimed, but it wasn't quick to forget Jonah's alleged role. Vindication in a courtroom didn't erase the whispers in the streets. Jonah leaned against the window of the hospital room where Tommy remained, recovering slowly but steadily. The thin winter sun streamed in, casting a pale glow over the stark white sheets. Tommy was propped up on pillows, his cheeks fuller now, though his voice remained soft. "People are still talking, aren't they?" Tommy asked, his perceptive eyes fixed on Jonah. Jonah nodded, not bothering to sugarcoat the truth. "Some of them, but Caleb says it'll die down. Eventually, people will remember the real story." Tommy smirked. "You mean the one where you were the hero?" Jonah laughed lightly. "Maybe not a hero, just someone who didn't give up." Tommy grinned. "Close enough." The following weeks were a whirlwind of change. Caleb had taken Jonah under his wing, bringing him into his modest home on the outskirts of the city. For the first time in years, Jonah slept in a real bed, surrounded by warmth and quiet. The scars of his time in the detention center lingered, though. He startled at loud noises, his dreams often haunted by the looming figure of Clemens. But Caleb was patient, guiding Jonah with a steady hand as he adjusted to life beyond the gray walls. One evening, as they sat by the fire in Caleb's sitting room, Jonah finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Caleb's face tightened, his gaze fixed on the flame. "After the war, I wasn't the same person, Jonah. I thought I'd lost you too. I didn't know how to come back." Jonah nodded slowly, understanding more than Caleb realized. He had spent years feeling lost too, drifting through the world without a tether. "You came back when it mattered," Jonah said quietly. Caleb's eyes softened. "And I'm not going anywhere now." As winter turned to spring, the scars of the fire began to fade from the city's landscape. The ruins of Mercer Mill were cleared away, replaced by empty lots and the occasional stray piece of rubble. But for Jonah, the fire's mark remained etched into his memory, a constant reminder of the injustice he had faced and overcome. The city's attitude toward Jonah slowly began to shift. Some factory workers approached him on the street, offering quiet apologies or small tokens of gratitude for exposing Wiggins's corruption. Others, still bitter over the fire's impact, kept their distance, their glares heavy with suspicion. Jonah learned to ignore them, focusing instead on rebuilding his life. Tommy's health improved steadily, though the doctor warned that his lungs would remain fragile. When Tommy was finally discharged, Jonah and Caleb brought him back to Caleb's house, where a spare room had been prepared for him. Tommy's eyes lit up when he saw the small, neatly made bed and the stack of books on the nightstand. "Is this mine?" Tommy asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "All yours," Caleb said with a smile. "You've earned it." Tommy turned to Jonah, his grin wide. "Guess we're roommates now." Jonah laughed. Better than sharing a bunk in the dorms. For the first time in what felt like forever, they both had a place to call home. One warm spring afternoon, Caleb surprised Jonah and Tommy with a trip to the city's edge. They rode in a rickety cart pulled by an old horse, the cobblestones giving way to dirt road. Jonah's brow furrowed as they approached a hill overlooking the wide expanse of water beyond. "What is this?" Jonah asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "You'll see," Caleb replied, a hint of a smile on his lips. As they crested the hill, the view unfolded before them. The ocean stretched endlessly, its surface glittering like liquid silver under the afternoon sun. The salty breeze ruffled Jonah's hair, and the distant cry of gulls echoed in the air. Tommy's breath hitched, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's real," he whispered. Jonah glanced at his friend, a grin spreading across his face. "Told you." They sat together on the hilltop, watching the waves crash against the shore. Caleb leaned back, his gaze distant but peaceful. "The ocean's a good place for new beginnings," he said softly. Jonah nodded, the weight of his past beginning to lift. For the first time, the future felt like a wide, open horizon, as boundless as the water before him. That evening, as they returned home, Jonah paused by the door, looking back at the fading light over the rooftops of Greystone. The city was still scarred, still flawed, but it was also his. He had fought for his name, for his freedom, and for the people who mattered most. And now, standing on the threshold of a new chapter, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar but welcome: hope. The late spring air carried the faint scent of blooming wildflowers as Jonah stepped out into the yard behind Caleb's house. Tommy sat cross-legged on the grass, a battered notebook balanced on his knees. He had taken to drawing lately, sketching scenes from his memory of the detention center and the city streets, each page a quiet testament to his resilience. Today, he was focused on a crude but heartfelt rendering of the ocean, the waves captured in jagged pencil strokes. "Not bad," Jonah said, sitting down beside him. "But you forgot the gulls." Tommy shot him a mock glare, though his grin quickly broke through. "I'll add them. Just need some inspiration." Jonah laughed, tipping his head back to let the sunlight warm his face. The world had grown brighter these past few weeks, its edges less sharp, its shadows less oppressive. Caleb had taken to calling it the quiet after the storm, and Jonah supposed he was right. The storm wasn't entirely over. There were still whispers in the streets, lingering doubts in the eyes of those who passed him, but it was fading, little by little. Inside the house, Caleb was preparing for another trip to the courthouse. The investigation into Wiggins's network of corruption had snowballed after the trial, and Caleb had become a central figure in dismantling the system that had enabled such injustice. Jonah admired his brother's determination, though it often left Caleb looking exhausted by the end of the day. "You don't have to do this forever, you know," Jonah said, as Caleb shrugged on his coat. Caleb paused, adjusting his collar. "Maybe not forever, but as long as there's work to be done, I'll keep going." Jonah nodded, his respect for Caleb growing with each passing day. "Thanks for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Caleb smiled, resting a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "You would have found a way, Jonah. You're stronger than you think." That evening, Jonah and Tommy sat on the front steps of the house, watching the city settle into twilight. The faint hum of voices and clatter of distant carriages drifted through the air, a gentle reminder of the life continuing all around them. "Do you think it's really over?" Tommy asked, his voice quiet. Jonah considered the question. "I think the worst is, but we'll always have to fight for what's right. That doesn't end." Tommy nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "As long as we're fighting together." Jonah smiled. "Always." A week later, a small envelope arrived for Jonah. The postmark was from the Greystone Mill Workers Union, a group that had formed in the wake of Wiggins's downfall. Jonah opened it cautiously, his heart skipping as he read the brief note inside. "Jonah, your bravery saved lives and changed this city. We'll never forget it. Thank you." Beneath the note was a slip of paper, an invitation to speak at the opening of a new factory, one built with safety and workers' rights at its core. Jonah stared at it, his hands trembling. "What is it?" Tommy asked, peering over his shoulder. Jonah handed him the note, his voice unsteady. They want me to speak, to tell my story." Tommy's grin was wide and full of pride. "You have to do it, Jonah. People need to hear the truth." Jonah hesitated, the weight of the past pressing down on him. But then he thought of the boys in the detention center, the workers who had suffered under Wiggins's greed, and the promise he had made to himself to never let the truth be buried again. "I'll do it," Jonah said finally, his voice firm. The day of the opening was clear and bright, the sunlight glinting off the polished machinery of the new factory. A small crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and hope. Jonah stood on a makeshift platform, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. Caleb stood off to the side, his reassuring smile steadying Jonah's nerves. Tommy sat in the front row, his notebook in hand, ready to capture the moment. Jonah took a deep breath and began to speak. "I was 14 when I was accused of a crime I didn't commit," he said, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "I spent months fighting to prove my innocence, but what I learned along the way is that the truth is never simple, and it's never easy. It takes courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when the world tries to silence you." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But I didn't do it alone. The people who believed in me, my brother, my friend Tommy, and others who risked everything to help me, they're the reason I'm standing here today. And they're the reason this city has a chance to rebuild, to do better." The crowd was silent, their attention fixed on him. Jonah's voice grew stronger. "We can't change the past, but we can fight for a future where no one has to endure what I did. A future where justice matters more than money, and where people come before profits. That's the future we're building here, and it's a future worth fighting for." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound washing over Jonah like a tide. He stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding, but his spirit soaring. Caleb clapped him on the shoulder, his pride evident. "You did good, Jonah," Caleb said. Jonah smiled, turning to where Tommy was sketching furiously in his notebook. "We all did." As the day wound down, Jonah and Tommy found themselves back at the hill overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm steady and soothing. Jonah leaned back on his elbows, the salty breeze ruffling his hair. "What now?" Tommy asked, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Jonah considered the question, a quiet smile spreading across his face. "Now? We keep going. There's always more to do." Tommy nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Think we'll ever see what's on the other side of the ocean?" Jonah laughed softly. "Maybe one day, but for now this is enough." As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Jonah felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, the future felt wide open, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. If you enjoyed The Ashes of Innocence, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories for more powerful, heartwarming tales like this. Leave a comment below. Your support keeps these stories alive.